Hi, welcome to another Privateers podcast where we speak to capital allocators, private equity players, operators, entrepreneurs, making a difference in the South African economy. And today it's my privilege to welcome Ndumiso Davidson, a skilled private equity player in his own right, became operator and now back into investment management with a more than 2 decade experience within the student accommodation space. So Ndumiso, welcome to the Privateers podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivier. And it's great to join an illustrious group of people who've sat in this chair.
So, and Ndumiso, I touched on briefly your journey that went into private equity, then you moved on into the operational role within one of those investments at Stay South Point, building it into arguably one of South Africa's leading student accommodation providers, and now a change in focus again with student living asset management. You want to talk us through those early days, what attracted you into the private equity space firstly, and then from there, what attracted you into the student accommodation space?
Yeah, it's interesting and it's a long story. And so, I mean, the story really begins with my parents in a way. And so, I was born into a family of entrepreneurs and multi-generational entrepreneurs.
Yes.
My grandparents owned general dealers and stores, both on my maternal and paternal side.
Yep.
So my grandfather had a store in Soweto, had a standard 2 education, ran a store for 50 years.
Yes.
My grandmother, my paternal side, had shops in the high street of Vryheid in the 40s.
Okay.
So they gave birth to my parents, and so they were entrepreneurs as well. So my mother, maybe till 10, had a kind of corporate job, and then thereafter ran my grandfather's store. And thereafter was actually the first woman rose farmer.
Oh,
So
wow.
she found a way into rose farming. This is in the mid 90s.
Okay.
And so I spent time, in the shops every weekend, every holiday, picked roses, drove the car to the airport. So it was mainly kind of export. But the person with the biggest influence on me from a kind of entrepreneurial standpoint was my dad. So my dad was a serial entrepreneur in the kind of broader sense of the word. So when I was born, he was managing artists, musicians. So he managed Brenda.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And in fact, his kind of journey of artist management kind of dates back to the late 60s when he lived in New York, Tribeca, with Hugh Masekela. And
Incredible.
just before Hugh Masekela broke, i.e. had the kind of #1 song in the US in 1968, is my father kind of followed him and was his road manager. And so that's kind of where his world started of kind of entrepreneurship. And then, he's done everything from, developer, contractor, had a mining services firm, did contract mining, a lot of things. And so, I was exposed, through his journey of entrepreneurship, attending meetings, but also just being kind of fully engaged in what he was doing, because he was always engaging us on kind of things that he was kind of busy with.
Yeah.
But there were very interesting, let's call it, intersections along the way, right? And so one of them, when I was 10 years old, one of the things I was involved in was he was involved in the acquisition of Radio Jacaranda. So at the time when ICASA was selling these kind of licenses, is my dad was involved in a consortium of Radio Jacaranda. And that's where I met Terry for the first time, right, as a 10-year-old, right? And so we kind of fast forward to, I'd spent some time when I came back from the US working for Merrill Lynch. Is after I leave Merrill Lynch, I want to get in private equity. And the kind of reasons for that is, having seen my dad being, the serial entrepreneur, is he seemed to be driven by the opportunity
Yes.
rather than kind of building a business. And what didn't happen, because he was kind of lurching from business to business, was kind of build this kind of idea of strategy and a fabric of let's call it kind of resilience into a business, right? So he wasn't building business; he was chasing opportunity. And so, for me, what I saw in private equity was an opportunity to really be in an apprenticeship where I could learn what the DNA is of really good business. And so that's really, why I wanted to be in private equity. And so it just so happened at the time at which I was leaving Merrill Lynch that Metier was in the process of being formed. And I reached out to Terry, and the first question Terry asked me is Peter Davidson your father? And so, that's how I ended up in Metier.
Wow, small world, eh?
Yeah.
So you met Terry all those years back. I didn't realize that that backstory. Incredible. Terry, a fellow merchant like myself.
Yes. So I met Terry in what would have been, I guess, 93, 94. Was the first time I met Terry.
So you get involved in Metier, one of the preeminent private equity firms in South Africa. Must have learned a lot there. How long were you with Metier?
I was at Metier for about 8 years. So in that period, I joined as an analyst. In fact, at the point at which I had reached out to Metier, they hadn't closed their fund. So I remember hounding Terry and said, "Look, I'd like to work for you for nothing." So started in what was their kind of CSI initiative, Kurisani, where they were doing investing on behalf of Love Life. And then from there, kind of joined the fund when they closed. So I spent kind of 8 years working on real estate, media, kind of entertainment-related sectors.
What are the key things you learned as a young professional there in that private equity environment?
So what was interesting about kind of Metier and their positioning was clearly Metier comes out of Brayton, the kind of founders there, where they did at the end a lot of leveraged finance deals, but their positioning at Metier was really growth capital investing, and so that was particularly interesting to me because what they were doing were investing in companies that were on this kind of journey of scale and growth. And in that process, for me, I thought there'd be an opportunity to really learn about businesses, but businesses in the progress on the process of scaling, right? And so, that really came out of my own kind of exposure through my parents of entrepreneurship is, what are the things in the kind of DNA of an organization and a business that make it successful. So learned an incredible amount there. And private equity is very much, about kind of apprenticeship. So what you learn is a lot about and a lot from being around investors like Terry and Hewitt and Paul Buerta. So kind of tremendous amount learned in that.
It must have been an interesting time getting to see that dynamic between what you would have seen growing up from an entrepreneurial spirit and now this more structured type environment, how you would, in a private equity at its best, enables those management teams to achieve what they want out of those businesses. So learning that a little bit. And so you walk this private equity journey for a little bit and you decide, what I actually want to do is I want to go become an operator in one of these investments.
Well, the decision wasn't that kind of cut and dry. I think, I'd been involved in South Point as a deal maker. We invested. So at the time, it had about 1,500 beds. And it's also interesting how we ended up making the investment because, traditionally, real estate isn't in the mandate of private equity investors, right? And so what was evident when we kind of looked at the opportunities that this was a business anchored in real estate, but was really a service business, right? And the economics defied a little bit of what people thought conventional kind of wisdom was around student housing, right? And so, what you had was a confluence of factors at the time, which was you could acquire assets and buildings relatively cheaply near universities. And there was, this massive insatiable demand. And so, they were acquiring buildings at first year starting yields of 30%, right? And there was also a lot of conventional wisdom that got kind of defied when we kind of, unpeeled the layers. So, what people thought about student housing at the time was, no one pays, students destroy buildings. And we realized that really wasn't true, right? And so you had students prioritized by their parents in terms of education and accommodation. And these were serious students from serious families, right? Where there was kind of a weight of expectation. And so what people thought students did in the, residences was not what students were doing, right? So, that really presented a really interesting and compelling business case and investment case, and the thesis was how do we go really hard and really fast before people realize and wake up to the opportunity, and that's
Trying to be a significant first mover.
exactly right, exactly. And so that's what we did. And so I was involved in kind of building and developing the business from 1,500 beds when we invested to, it's now about 14,000, operating in 5 different
It's a
cities.
monster.
Yeah, so it's a big business,
Yes.
and there was a lot learned along the way. And so the kind of founding team didn't really go along the full journey, and that in itself was a lesson, right? Around how do founders of businesses scale their business as it becomes bigger and ultimately more institutionalized. And this is really what I was seeking to learn, which my parents weren't able to do. They simply didn't have the tools to kind of build sustainable businesses, and that's really what I learned. And so the opportunity to move across from an operational standpoint really comes about not as a result of a plan, but more as a result of an opportunity that emerged,
Okay.
right? And so the founders leave around 2011, 2012. We had appointed a CEO that didn't come from real estate. And there was an opportunity to move across as a COO.
Right.
And so that really was the opportunity that I saw and kind of grabbed with both hands.
Did you enjoy that operational role? Was it something that you were craving, that you wanted that bit from your family history, or is that what motivated you?
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. Is you sit as an investor, and you kind of act through people,
Yes.
right? So the strategy is implemented by the team on the ground, and you are kind of part of developing that strategy and kind of business plan, but you aren't operating, right? So ultimately, you aren't responsible for the implementing of that plan. And so for me, the opportunity was to be in the business implementing the strategy and the plan, and that's really what I saw. And so for me, private equity was always a stepping stone into entrepreneurship. I didn't know what form it would take, but through some point, the opportunity emerged.
And what are the lessons you've learned that sometimes founders get wrong when they're trying to scale up these businesses? You've seen it firsthand. What are some of the lessons you could share?
Look, I think in the kind of journey of a business, particularly in its formative years, is you are everything, right? And so you are the salesperson, you are HR, you are doing the collecting. Is as the business scales, is you really need to kind of build the systems, and you need to build an organization where you affect these through people. And so there are talented entrepreneurs that are able to kind of make that transition, but for others, it's a little bit more difficult, right? And the kind of command and control it has its limits. And so if you look at a business like Southpoint, it's one thing to have 1,500 beds across 8 properties in one location, being Braamfontein. I think when you now are a business of 10,000 beds across 5 cities, it's a completely different proposition, right? And so you then need to kind of develop the systems and develop the people to be able to run a business of that scale. And so, one of the kind of maybe simple examples was, when you opened your bed and you had 1,500 students in Braamfontein, is you would be full naturally. Is the challenge that Southpoint had was, when you're at 10,000 beds, is you need a marketing plan.
Yes.
You need a marketing team. So it's not that the demand isn't there, is that you haven't created the awareness that's required to have people fill your beds. And those were some of the challenges that were
And how did you go about tackling that?
So it really starts with developing a kind of marketing and sales strategy. And so that was something that they didn't have, because the belief at the time was, look, we just needed to kind of open our doors. And so
Have the beds and they will come.
and they will come, right? And so, even with a product that's is required, you do need to create the awareness. So we start off with kind of developing the plan, which is really centered around creating the awareness around not only the kind of bed, but we were selling a lifestyle and an environment that was conducive. And then you kind of develop a team to implement that. And that's really kind of what we did. And so, in the kind of initial years, South Point's occupancy had dropped to 75%, right? Which, shouldn't be a case where you have that much demand. But through kind of a simple marketing plan and implementing a kind of marketing strategy, which was centered on peer-to-peer, so we had students sell to students,
Okay.
we were quickly able to kind of turn that around.
Yeah, and Ndumiso, in those early days, this was very much pioneering stuff, trying to convince the institutions that actually student accommodation is an investable asset class in its own rights.
Right.
How did you get that story across to the institutions? Because you clearly raised a lot of money from them.
So, well, I guess starting with kind of Metier days, I think Metier was one of the first institutional investors in student housing, right? And so, in engaging and reporting back to investors, we had to articulate the story, from the perspective of an institutional investor, right? So what made it institutionally investable? And so in that process is you begin to kind of refine the story from kind of an institutional perspective. And it is in some ways quite simple, right? Is that, you've had in the South African context is universal access to universities. And so enrollments have kind of more than doubled in the kind of 30 years post 94.
Yep.
But the infrastructure investment hasn't kept up, right? In many respects. So on campus, it hasn't in terms of, teaching facilities and infrastructure. And, the accommodation certainly had no investment in it. And so you had the structural undersupply that made for a kind of compelling investment case from a demand standpoint. And in the kind of beginning years before kind of NSFAS story, is you had parents that would pay almost anything to ensure that not only did their kids have an opportunity to access tertiary education, but they wouldn't do anything to ensure that the environment within which they found themselves resulted in the high success rates academically.
Yeah, I think for many parents, kind of giving their kids the opportunity to further themselves through education is one of the very few gifts you can give your children. So no doubt they would have latched onto that.
Right. And so, in the priority of, let's call it expenses and payments that a family had, this would be close to the top. And we saw that. And so, one of the conventional wisdoms was, people don't pay, students don't pay, is the bad debts were next to nothing, right? They were kind of less than 0.5%.
Yeah.
And so there was evidence of how important, education and accommodation was for students attending university at the time.
Yeah, a very interesting point that. And so then later on, in comes NSFAS into the whole equation. And how does that start to influence the business model for you?
It changes it fundamentally, right? And so, when South Point started, NSFAS was always there, right? So NSFAS was there as an allowance, right? And so there were students who were funded by NSFAS, and there was allowance that they received, but the rental was determined by us as the owners of the asset. What happens around 2015, 2016 was the advent of fees must fall, right? And so a very kind of legitimate campaign by students around saying university accommodation as well as tuition was becoming unaffordable. And so they were bringing attention to that as a major issue. And so the response from government rightly was to significantly increase the fiscal commitment towards education. And there has been since 2015 probably a tenfold increase in the subsidy for NSFAS, right? So it's gone from 4.5 billion to about 45 billion. And that's positive as a development. What does happen, which is less positive, is government begins to play a much bigger role in the sector, right? And so if you think about what role they play as a stakeholder, is they a sponsor through the commitments they make through the fiscus,
Yeah.
but they're also a client, right? And so they ultimately are the university. They're also a competitor in that they provide accommodation on campus. But the issue really comes in relation to some of the regulation that got brought in, right? And so what comes in is the introduction of minimum normal standards. So effectively, government dictated what needed to be built, but that didn't necessarily reconcile with what they were able to afford.
Okay.
And so that really brought some strain to the economic model of student housing. In addition, they introduced kind of accreditation policies that weren't completely kind of aligned with the reality of South Africa. So what happened kind of post 2015 is the government playing a much bigger role in student housing that in a way began to adversely affect some of the economics of providing student housing.
Sure.
And notwithstanding that they made a kind of bigger commitment. And so some of the work that we do now through the industry body that I chair is through kind of policy engagement is try to get that alignment, is to say, what is it that you'd like us to build, but how does it align to what you're able to pay? Because we've now transitioned from it being allowance to the government ultimately determining what the rental rate should be. So there isn't an escalation framework, as an example. So as we sit today, which is days away from April, is there hasn't been communication around what the NSFAS rate is for 2026. Which is crazy, right?
Yeah, that is crazy.
And
You've had students with you for a few months now.
Exactly, right? So that number could be 0, it could be 6. We don't know. But if it's 0, it's clearly a massive problem because in your kind of inputs, those are rising kind of double digits, right? If you're talking about electricity and water. So that's been the kind of development of the space. And so, that notwithstanding, is the SLAM story really emerges out of opportunities that still exist in space. So in the top end, outside of the NSFAS market, there are opportunities there. There are genuine opportunities for consolidation in what is largely fragmented space. And there's a general lack of liquidity. I'm talking from a kind of investment perspective. And so if you are an owner of a development or you have a portfolio and you'd like to kind of realize some proceeds from that, there isn't.
It's an all or nothing.
It's an all or nothing, right? And so, yeah, the SLAM story really emerges out of an opportunity to consolidate a fragmented market and acquire kind of best-in-class assets.
Yes.
In the space, and so we've managed to raise about R1 billion from institutional funders. But for us,
so that says student living asset management.
This is at student living asset management, yes.
Which is your current role?
Yes. Yeah. So, we around 2023 we saw the opportunity for a institutional platform.
Yes.
And what we had observed in the market was, there was the emergence of the Growth Point Student Housing Fund. Momentum also had raised their own student housing fund in Eris, through Eris. So we saw growing institutional appetite from an investor perspective. And, we thought that there'd be an opportunity for a fund that maybe focused not only on NSFAS, but on the entire kind of market segment and spectrum. And so that's what we did. The reason why we've kind of focused on trying to shift the kind of policy environment is we also think that there's a massive opportunity once there is an alignment of policy around delivering or beginning to kind of bridge the shortfall of 300,000 to 400,000 beds.
I mean, isn't this all part of the same journey of this sector maturing? Like the original founder story of the South Point, it takes a bit of time for it to get to the scale that it got to, but now you've got this next leg, which is student living asset management, this more institutional type. It's just a natural progression of maturing of it and it proving the thesis that it is its own asset class.
Right. No, so it is really the kind of arc of the maturity of the space. And so you had Metier making, let's call it maybe the first institutional investment.
Yes.
We bought Metier out, funded by the PIC, which was another significant event in relation to institutional interest into the into the sector. And what you've had more recently is the funds, as I've mentioned, that have kind of come to the fore, as well as SLAM.
Yeah.
And so, the asset has become less alternative, more mainstream.
More mainstream.
But there are, let's call it, policy structural issues that need to be addressed for it really to kind of emerge as a large asset class.
Yeah. And Ndumiso, towards the end of last year, you acquired a 51% stake in probably Stellenbosch's biggest student accommodation academia. Tell us a little bit more about that transaction. What do you think the importance of that transaction is for SLAM?
So, as I mentioned, our investment strategy was really centered on a number of kind of key pillars, but the main ones were, we saw an opportunity for market consolidation. So the space was fragmented. We did see a lack of liquidity generally in the space. And also we had positioned ourselves slightly different to the other funds that had a prescription around NSFAS. Is our mandate allowed us to invest across the spectrum. And so we were kind of fortunate to have the opportunity to acquire academia, right, which represents a very interesting asset, right? And so academia was one of the first public-private partnerships of development on campus, right? And so there's only two that I'm aware of that have been done successfully. So the one is academia and the other was COVAX, which was done at UWC. And so this was developed academia was developed about 25 years ago by Jonathan Brawl on university land directly opposite the engineering department, and has about 1,000 beds. But what academia kind of represents is a flagship asset in, let's call it, a university that attracts a lot of affluent students, right? And it's really the attractiveness of the winelands and Stellenbosch as a town and the lifestyle. And an asset that's unique when you kind of compare it to some of the challenges that you face with NSFAS, right? And so, you're leasing probably 6 months before the commencement of an academic year. The students would pay before they'd move in January. So you don't have these challenges of collecting. You're still a let's call it price maker in that market. And it's an asset with a lot of demand, just given it's not only its location, but it's really an extension of the university residence system. And so it's really a fantastic asset for us to kind of anchor the SLAM strategy.
So, Ndumiso, as someone who's developed a number of assets within this space, what do you think that observers underestimate the challenges in the sector to be? And what do you think that they have missed on the opportunity side of things?
Look, I think anyone kind of looking at accommodation, and accommodation is one of the spaces where the opportunities exist as an operator with 5 beds or wanting to develop 1,000 beds, but the challenges are more or less the same wherever you're entering the space. And often the lens that people look at student accommodation is really purely on the demand side. And so that exists. But that alone doesn't make it a kind of compelling investment. I think the challenges with NSFAS are really a major kind of impediment to the kind of economic model of providing student accommodation. So, you have some providers, mainly the kind of smaller end, who haven't been paid for a year, right? And so that becomes impossible to kind of run any kind of business. But on a kind of macro level, is the lack of kind of policy coherence and certainty is a major impediment for investors in the space. So as I mentioned, that we sit today and there isn't a escalation allowance for 2026. The escalation for 2025 was 4%, and then that's against the backdrop of double-digit inflation, inflation, particularly on the input side. So for an investor, particularly an institutional investor, looking to invest in real estate, is you're looking for income growth. And so in a scenario where your escalations are, let's call it, at or lower than inflation, and your cost inputs are rising at double digits, it makes it difficult to make a case for a NSFAS type of offering and product. And so in our positioning as SLAM is that we've got and had the flexibility to operate across the spectrum. And so what you see in an asset like academia is historically it's achieved close to 9%. And in the last year, we would have done more than kind of 10%, around kind of 11%.
And still at huge 100% occupancy, long waiting lists to get into it.
Right. And so, we would have had, 3 applications for every available bed, right, for academia.
That's incredible.
So in those markets, you're able to get the income growth that we kind of promise our institutional investors.
Those sort of numbers talk to really a market that's got much more legs on it in terms of what could be provided into that market space.
Right. And so, why kind of an academia would be kind of, a compelling investment is, and this speaks to how investors should look at student housing, is you really should look at a university and a town, right? And so in that is you would need to understand the university as a counterparty, right? And understand what the kind of drivers of enrollment are for that particular institution.
Right.
So if you look at Stellenbosch as an example, it's an institution of kind of high demand. But if you look at what you're able to build at Stellenbosch is on the supply side is that you're not going to get 10,000 beds built there, right? And so the town planning is restrictive. And, it is an expensive place to kind of buy property. And so on the supply side it is kind of defensive. But on the enrollment side, which drives demand, is that continues to be robust. And so you need to kind of look at, each institution. So if you go to a kind of the opposite extreme, is, you could try and build in Harrismith, right? But if you're going to a small municipality, is you're confronted with a whole bunch of other challenges, right? And so, in your development, you're going to have to build in redundancy for water, redundancy for electricity. It is going to cost you more to build in those towns because typically your kind of contractors come from the major cities and they need to be compensated for going to smaller towns. So it's understanding all of those kind of dynamics. And then in those towns, typically the students are funded by NSFAS, right? And so you've got that challenge around, well, what does the escalation framework look like? Am I going to be paid on time? So those are some of the considerations around kind of developing.
And what are your longer term aspirations for SLAM? If we could sit here in 5 years' time and said, if I've achieved the following items, we would have done this thing properly.
So for us, we've got, some capital raise that we'd like to kind of deploy. And so we're being quite careful about how we're doing that. And so we're fortunate to have kind of anchored the portfolio with an academia. So we've acquired 51%. We're in the process of acquiring the balance. We're looking at some opportunities in Cape Town, again on the top end, where we see opportunity. But for us, the opportunity set needs to be much larger than kind of a nuanced top end offering. Is we want to be a capital provider to a much bigger solution around student housing. And so what needs to happen for that to become a reality is we do need to fix the policy issues, right? And so that's something that we're working very hard on, right? And so with NSFAS, with the department, with Treasury, it's about saying, how do we deliver 100,000, 200,000 beds? Because the limiting factor is not capital. It's really an environment that capital is able to be mobilized in a significant way. And so that's what we're kind of focusing on. And so what we often kind of draw parallels to is what's happened in other infrastructure asset classes. So if you look at what's happened in energy generation, is it was really the alignment of policy that enabled large-scale mobilization of capital to solve the problem. Unfortunately, in South Africa, is we often respond only in situations of crisis, right? And so the student housing issue is becoming a crisis. I would argue has been a crisis. So that's something that we need to do. And we're seeing signs of this as well in rail and general kind of transportation infrastructure. In water as well. So for us, what we hope to see and what we're hoping to drive is this kind of policy environment that and enables the mobilization of capital in a way that we're not talking about 1,000, 2,000 beds. We're talking about a national plan that addresses the needs of each university, where we're able to deliver 20,000, 40,000 beds at a time.
Yeah, in this practice, we do a lot of work within the mining sector, and that theme about regulatory certainty comes up regularly in that conversation as well. Because capital goes where it feels welcome, where it knows it can get the return that it wants to get at.
Right.
And I look at that opportunity that you talk about 100,000 beds, 200,000 beds. Can you imagine the catalytic impact that would have in the economy if we could get that development right, if we could get that infrastructure right, and it would result in the recapitalization and the rebuilding of some of these student towns?
Exactly, and so, when people talk about, what are the issues or how do we kind of catalyze growth, is a good start is having infrastructure that works.
Yes.
Right. And so, and what we do have is examples of how that's been successfully implemented. So again, to the idea of kind of energy generation. So it's not like the models and the templates don't exist, is how those get transplanted into the areas in which they're needed. And so, if you imagine a South Africa where you've addressed energy generation, you've addressed rail and infrastructure, rail and transportation infrastructure, you've addressed education infrastructure, you've addressed water infrastructure, is everything follows from there, assuming clearly that we have a kind of fiscal policy that also supports it, is that gets us a long way to where we need to be.
Yeah. I can see the passion kicked in immediately there as you started talking about the potential that's out there. But what motivates you in business?
Look, I'm motivated by a lot of things, and I've been fortunate to be in a business where the motivation is kind of clear and evident in every day you kind of come to work. And so, and I was kind of recounting the other day, is we've had over 200,000 kids kind of go through South Point, right? And for each one of those kids, the opportunity to get an education and to ultimately kind of catapult themselves and their family into a different sphere of kind of earning and possibility is something that that's inspiring, and so this happens in the kind of bricks and mortar, but it's really in the environment that we provide, and most operators now go beyond just providing a room. Is you're providing kind of mental kind of wellness programs, you're providing kind of academic support, you're introducing them to people in industry, so you're inspiring them and their potential. And so in the interactions with students, what we have is a generation of people and kids who want to make a difference. And so our role as investors, operators, as government, is really to kind of give them the opportunity for them to succeed, and we don't always do that very well.
Ban Ki-moon was recently asked about the lessons South Africa could learn from what's happened within South Korea. And one of the areas that he really honed in on is educate our people, have fit for purpose education. And this fits exactly within that framework. It was something that he said fairly recently.
Yeah. If you look at the stats and the numbers, so there's the anecdotal kind of experiences that you have. But if you look at the kind of numbers, is in that 15 to kind of 25 age group, is unemployment is close to 50% for people that haven't attended post-school, right? But if you look at the post-school, is that numbers as low as 11.5%. Now it's clear that the opportunity is what makes the difference. Now they may not be working in the areas that they study, but they are gainfully employed and kind of contributing positively. So the education, I think, can't be disputed. It makes a massive.
It's a significant
difference.
lever for.
Yeah, it's a big lever. It's a big lever.
And as a South African, are you generally an optimistic South African? Does it motivate you?
Yeah, I would definitely define myself as an optimist, and definitely a South African optimist. I studied in the US, arrived there in kind of 99, left in 2003. But at the point at which I was graduating, my father asked me, whether I want to kind of continue to work in the US, and I'd intern at Citigroup in New York the summer before. But for me, is I wanted to kind of come home and contribute, and that was also, a result of the opportunities that I always saw here. So I've seen it in what my father had done in a time where opportunities weren't, many.
Yeah.
But as I kind of came back, kind of 2003, 2004, is there were many more opportunities, certainly for me. So, I'm certainly kind of an optimist. I had this conversation with someone the other day, and I think you and I maybe have had this discussion, is South Africa seemed to be in the precipice for 30 years, right?
Yes.
And we manage, at every turn to kind of continue on a path. And there's some periods that are better than others, but you have to be an optimist if you are South African, because we've survived notwithstanding all of the challenges, and there've been many.
It was a conversation we had bumped into each other in the airport, and we were busy talking about exactly that. So it has felt for 30, 40 years that South Africa is 48 hours away from collapse, and yet we have this in our DNA to make things work and to get things done.
Yeah.
It's part of our culture.
Yeah. And so if you kind of look at maybe the last 6 months, right, where probably the most, let's call it, positive sentiment in maybe 10 to 15 years. And then, we've now, like everyone, been affected by what's happening in the kind of geopolitical space.
Sure.
But I think the South African story is still positive and compelling. And so in our space, we're certainly kind of positive around the prospects.
Yeah.
And
Ndumiso, if I take you right back to the beginning, and you shared some really insightful stories about your childhood and that entrepreneurial spirit, and you followed a tried and tested route of education, a really good school, a really good university, went into a banking world, so followed a really traditional path into private equity, in full circle out of that into operational, and then back into asset management. What part of that journey have you enjoyed the most?
Look, I think it's hard to say which I've enjoyed the most. I mean, I think it's been a journey, and so as an individual, I'm often very focused on where I am currently, and I look ahead, but not too far ahead. All of them have been enjoyable, and all of them have led to the next thing. That's been the interesting part of my journey. I think if I hadn't spent a year in investment banking, I wouldn't have been prepared for the world of private equity. If I hadn't spent time understanding businesses, it would have been impossible for me to kind of step into a business at a relatively senior level and contribute. And if I hadn't spent 10 years as an operator, I think that would have made me a less compelling investor. So all of them kind of contribute to the kind of next phase. And so in the phase that I'm in now, it is different coming back into the world of investing, having been an operator. Is the kind of the lens of opportunity and how you engage with kind of management team and operational teams is very different to having been an investor, right? And so you kind of focus more intently on the levers that make a difference, right? Which was beneficial coming into an operational role, because you also focused on what was most likely to have the biggest impact from a kind of value creation standpoint. And so, oftentimes operators that have always been an operating role, there's often a lot of distraction in a business.
Being an operator is a busy place to be.
It's a very busy place to be. And so if you haven't kind of distilled what's important for the business to kind of move forward and achieve its objectives, you can get lost in the noise.
Ndumiso, no doubt, had a very successful career. It's very obvious to see that. And you will be seen as a role model for many of those students that go through your accommodation where you are currently. What bit of advice could you give those students? Something that they need to be paying attention to right now. If you could say, hey, Mr. Student, pay attention to this. This is what will be the thing that'll set you apart down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think, one thing I've noticed in not only engaging students, but when I look at the matric results, it seems like the world's a lot more competitive space.
Much more.
The world's a much more competitive space, and so I think coming out of that system is that you've got to find ways of differentiating yourself. And so getting 4As when I was in matric was exceptional. Getting 4As now is no longer an exceptional thing. And so, how you develop other parts of yourself, I think are important in differentiating yourself in the kind of work environment. And this is where, I found the US higher education system quite interesting. Is there isn't a focus there on vocational training. It's very much a kind of generalist education. And they focus a lot on the general skills that kind of make you a success. And so, whether it's just being interesting, right? And so, I did everything from, art history, biology, geography as part of my, economics undergraduate. And that provided me a perspective in a world that would have been different had I been, let's say, focused on being an accountant. I mean, nothing against accountants. So I think that's important. I think it's, how do you kind of develop yourself as a person? Terry has an interesting example. I use a lot of kind of Terry, isms, but this kind of illustrates the example of kind of developing other parts of yourself. He always said kind of beware of the C average kid, right? Because when you are kind of successful academically at school, is that becomes a kind of complete focus for you. And sometimes developing, let's call it interpersonal skills, or the ability to kind of to network or be affable, sometimes kind of getting neglected. And so I would say to a kind of a young kid is, be a fully rounded person, and expose yourself and understand, the world as it is. And it shouldn't be a focus just on the skills. And so in a world of AI and the democratization of knowledge, is this really the other things that are going to differentiate yourself in this world?
Yeah, I think that's a really lovely way for us to bring our conversation to an end, and that in all of this thing, even when you're building a big portfolio like you have, the humanity within it is still important. I mean, people fundamentally want to do business with people that they like. And I think that's sage advice. Thank you very much, Ndumiso. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I wish you all the very best for SLAM in the future, and I know you'll take it to even greater heights than it is currently.
Great, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.